From the moment I first held him, I remember feeling a weight that was both profound and comforting. They tell you that the journey of parenthood is one of unconditional love. But they don't tell you how much of your own heart, your own self, you'll pour into that love. For years, I've wondered if he even knew, if he ever realized how much I invested in each moment. Each step he took. Each lesson I shared. Back then, I imagined his future as something bright and boundless. Little did I know how different his path would turn out to be from the dreams I had nurtured in silence. Growing up, my life had been a blueprint: study hard, go to college, build a career, settle down. It was a narrative etched deeply in me, handed down through generations, like a family heirloom. In my world, success was synonymous with stability and purpose. So, as I watched him grow, I assumed naively, perhaps that he would find the same inner compass guiding him. But there were signs, even from a young age, that his interests and energy didn't quite align with what I had envisioned. It began innocently enough. He had a creative, wandering mind, always curious. But his focus was fleeting. One month it would be dinosaurs, the next, space, a week later, maybe drawing or music. I loved watching him explore, delighted in his wonder, even if I secretly hoped he'd find one thing to latch onto, something that could be a foundation for his future. But as the years went on, he drifted from one interest to the next without ever sinking deep enough into any of them. And while that might seem typical of a child, something in me began to worry, a quiet but persistent fear, like a subtle chill on a warm day. When he reached his teenage years, that worry grew. I could sense an indifference in him toward the future that was unfamiliar to me. I watched other kids his age, bright-eyed and enthusiastic, diving into extracurriculars, planning for college, discussing their dreams. In contrast, he seemed unbothered. He didn't talk about what he wanted to be when he grew up, and the usual high school milestones barely seemed to register with him. His grades were average at best, his motivation fleeting, and his conversations about the future almost non-existent. I told myself it was just a phase, that teenagers were often like this. But as graduation approached and his friends started talking about college acceptances and career plans, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was amiss. As he entered high school, those small moments of drift began to grow into something more pronounced. His teachers often described him as a bright student, capable when he applied himself. But that last part, when he applied himself, became a constant refrain. I'd hear it during parent-teacher conferences, read it on report cards, see it reflected in the way he'd sometimes start a project with fervor, only to lose interest halfway through. At first, I tried to chalk it up to the struggles of adolescence. High school, after all, is a time of great change, a time of testing boundaries. But while his friends started finding their footing, talking about future careers or the colleges they hoped to attend, my son seemed to float through the years without an anchor. He was present, physically there, but in some way always distant. I remember one evening vividly. He was in his junior year, and we were sitting at the dinner table. I brought up the topic of college, expecting at least some spark of interest or excitement. Have you thought about where you want to go? Or what you might want to study? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, casual. He barely looked up from his plate, giving a half-hearted shrug before mumbling, I don't know. College isn't really my thing, I guess. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Not his thing? It was as if he'd just casually tossed away an entire future. I felt my pulse quicken, a tinge of frustration bubbling up. But I tried to remain calm. You're still young, I replied. You don't have to have everything figured out. But it's good to at least think about what might come next. He didn't respond, and we sat there in silence. A silence that, in that moment, felt vast and impenetrable. From then on, it seemed like every conversation about the future only pushed him further away. I'd bring up ideas, suggest he try new things, encourage him to at least keep his options open. But each time he'd retreat further into himself, his responses growing shorter, his interest dwindling. Eventually, he stopped participating in these conversations altogether, and I was left with a growing sense of helplessness, wondering if I was driving him away by wanting too much for him. At night, I'd lie awake, turning the situation over in my mind. Where had I gone wrong? Had I pressured him too much? Expected too much? Or had I somehow failed to guide him, to ignite that spark of ambition within him? My own parents had been strict, their expectations clear, and though it hadn't always been easy, I thrived under that structure. Yet here I was, with a son who seemed immune to the very thing that had driven me forward. I felt as if I were standing at the edge of a cliff, watching him drift further and further out of reach, with no way to pull him back. By the time his senior year arrived, my concern had grown into something heavier, more urgent. College applications were a pressing topic for his peers, and every parent around me seemed to be caught up in the whirlwind of campus tours, application essays, and scholarship research. But in our home, the topic of college was a ghost of presence that lingered but was never acknowledged. I'd bring it up occasionally, only to be met with vague responses or, worse, silence. There was one evening that stands out among the others. After a particularly difficult day at work, I found myself feeling more impatient than usual. I sat down with him, determined to have a serious talk. I laid out options, suggested he consider at least applying to a local community college, maybe pick up a part-time job or an internship to gain some experience. I was trying to be logical, to show him a path forward without being too demanding. But as I spoke, I could see his expression harden, his gaze shifting away. Finally, he spoke. Why does it matter so much to you? I don't get why you can't just let me be. The question caught me off guard, and I found myself struggling for words. It matters because this is your future. I managed. You can't just drift forever. Life doesn't wait. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding. But then he shook his head, almost in disbelief, and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the heavy silence that settled in his absence. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after he'd gone to bed, replaying the conversation in my mind. His words echoed within me, filling me with a gnawing sense of doubt. Why did it matter so much to me? Was I projecting my own fears onto him? Or was I simply scared of what his future might look like if he continued down this path? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my frustration was as much about my own anxieties as it was about his lack of direction. I was terrified that I was failing him, that my inability to inspire him was somehow a reflection of my own shortcomings as a parent. After that night, I decided to take a different approach. If pushing him wasn't working, maybe I needed to try something else. I started small, asking about his day, showing interest in the things he enjoyed, no matter how trivial they seemed. I wanted to understand him, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I learned that he had a fleeting interest in photography, spending hours capturing images on his phone. So, I surprised him with a camera, hoping it might spark something. For a few days, he seemed interested, even excited, and I dared to hope. But soon enough, the camera was left untouched, another item collecting dust. Next, I tried to connect through his love of music. He'd always had an eclectic taste, and I thought maybe we could bond over shared interests. I listened to the songs he played, tried to engage him in conversations about the lyrics, the artists, but he brushed off my attempts, as if my involvement somehow tainted the purity of his interest. No matter what I tried, he remained distant, his walls impenetrable. I began to realize that I might never fully understand his world, that perhaps he was carrying burdens I couldn't see. It pained me to accept it. But as a parent, there's a point where you have to step back, to let them figure out who they are without constantly hovering. I wasn't ready to give up, but I could feel myself reaching the end of my efforts, wondering if perhaps I was the one who needed to change, to let go of the dreams I had for him and instead embrace the person he was becoming, even if that person was someone I didn't fully understand. One night, after another fruitless attempt to connect with him, I found myself alone in the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. The silence was almost deafening, pressing down on me like a weight I could neither ignore nor shake. I was overwhelmed by a sense of loss, a profound sadness that I had tried so hard to deny. Somewhere along the way, it seemed I had lost my son. Or maybe, just maybe, I had never really known him to begin with. I began to wonder if I'd missed something crucial, if there was a point along the way where I could have chosen differently, been a better father, someone who could nurture his dreams instead of imposing my own. Looking back, I saw so many moments that seemed, in hindsight, like crossroads, small, seemingly insignificant choices that perhaps had steered us onto this path of disconnection. My own life had been so clear, so structured. My parents' values, their expectations, had guided me, giving me a framework to follow. And I had trusted in that. It hadn't always been easy, but it had given me purpose. Was it wrong for me to want the same for him? Or was my need for him to find stability rooted in my own fear of an uncertain future? I couldn't be sure. As I sat there, lost in these thoughts, I felt an overwhelming urge to let go. Not of him, but of the vision I had held so tightly for so long. I realized, painfully, that perhaps I had been holding on to an image of who he could be, a projection of my own dreams and desires, instead of seeing the person he actually was. I had wanted him to be happy, successful, driven, but maybe my definition of those things wasn't the same as his. The decision to let go wasn't easy. It felt like surrender, like admitting defeat. But deep down, I knew that clinging to these expectations was only driving us further apart. He wasn't going to change just because I wanted him to. And the more I tried to mold him into someone he wasn't, the more I risked losing him entirely. And so, I resolved to step back, to allow him the space to find his own way, even if that meant watching him stumble and fall. With this newfound acceptance, I began to notice subtle shifts in our relationship. I stopped bringing up college, stopped pushing him toward paths he didn't seem to want. Instead, I tried to meet him where he was, offering my support without strings attached. I encouraged him in the small things, celebrated minor victories, and tried to show him that my love wasn't conditional on his success or failure. There were still difficult days. Of course, days when I'd see other parents sharing their children's achievements, hear about young adults securing promising jobs or scholarships, and feel a pang of envy or regret. But I'd remind myself that my son's journey was his own, and that all I could do was walk beside him, offering guidance when he needed it and silence when he didn't. He still drifted, his interests ever changing, but I began to see glimpses of someone thoughtful, kind, and creative. He volunteered at a local animal shelter, spent time mentoring younger kids in our neighborhood, and even took on a few odd jobs here and there. Nothing long-term, nothing groundbreaking, but enough to give me a sense that he was, in his own way, beginning to carve out a place for himself in the world. In time, I came to realize that my role wasn't to define his path, but to support him as he discovered it for himself. I had to trust that, no matter where he ended up, he would find his own sense of purpose, even if it didn't fit neatly into the boxes I had once imagined for him. Months passed, and I began to see more of him, a different side of him that I hadn't noticed before. He'd talk about his volunteer work, share stories about the animals he cared for, the kids he mentored, and I could see a light in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. He was still uncertain, still without a clear direction, but he was engaged, present in a way he hadn't been before. One evening, as we were sitting together after dinner, he looked over at me, almost hesitantly, and said, "I think I might want to go back to school, maybe study social work or something like that." His voice was quiet, as if he were testing the idea out loud for the first time, unsure of how it would be received. I felt a warmth spread through me, a surge of pride mixed with relief. I didn't want to overreact, didn't want to push, so I simply nodded and said, "That sounds like a great idea. I think you'd be good at it." He nodded back, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And in that moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. I didn't know if he would follow through on this idea, or if it would be yet another fleeting interest. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was beginning to find his own path, however winding or uncertain it might be. As he spoke about his hopes, his dreams, I realized that he was finally allowing himself to imagine a future one that was uniquely his. And in that moment, I knew that I had made the right choice. That my decision to let go had been a step toward building a bridge between us. One rooted not in expectations but in acceptance and understanding. I could see now that his journey would be different from mine. That he might take detours, make mistakes, and even experience failure. But those were lessons he would need to learn on his own, without me hovering over him, trying to shield him from every possible misstep. And I felt, perhaps for the first time, a deep sense of hope, not because he had a clear plan, but because he had the courage to begin searching for one. In the end, parenting is less about shaping our children into who we think they should be, and more about giving them the freedom to become who they truly are. And as I sat there, listening to my son talk about his future, I felt grateful for him, for his journey, and for the privilege of being a part of it, however small or uncertain my role might be.